Welcome, my friends, to the latest edition of Here's What We Know. And let me just jump right into this. When the publicist reaches out and they're like, hey, would you like to talk to so and so? And in this case, they reached out and said, would you like to talk to the great, 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 great grandson of the infamous Captain Kidd? I'm like, go on. Yes. And here's the thing, his name is Samuel Marquis because I finally learned how to pronounce it. And so let me just give you a background. Best-selling, award-winning author, specializing in historical fiction and nonfiction, a focus on American history from colonial times through World War II. And he's a professional hydrogeologist, which I find hilarious considering his family history. This is Samuel Marquis. Samuel, how are you?
Good. Great to be here, Gary.
I am thrilled to have you. I'm fascinated by you folks who can write books. And this is the book right here. Captain Kidd, the true story of treasure and betrayal. And I literally, when we came on here, what did I tell you? I was on page 351. I was just wrapping up your summation of everything in this. When did you find out you were the ninth great grandson removed from Captain William Kidd?
I found out people have been asking this, and I didn't realize that it wasn't like when I was super young. It happened, I think, in the late 60s when I was around 7 or 8. And some family genealogist said, "Oh, we're related to the Captain Kidd." And so to me, it was like, "Oh, cool, I'm related to a pirate." I was a kid. By then I had done, I think, Pirates of the Caribbean was my favorite ride. I mean, every kid who grew up then, that was the best thing at going out to Disneyland when I was a kid. So I was excited by it, but it wasn't a super big deal because we didn't debate it all the time. And then I wrote a term paper. I mean, not even a term paper, a paper in high school that was horrible. I crammed it in 2 nights. I got the ultimate slacker's grade, B minus. But I talked about my ninth great grandfather, Captain Kidd. And, I think I was somewhat sympathetic, but I was still like, well, he was a pirate. So I grew up with stories. It was all kind of Treasure Island type nonsense, really, because we didn't have any concrete things. It was all just the mythology. So I grew up with the mythology, and then I wrote the term paper, in high school and crammed it in, of course. And so, and then since then, we talk about it, but it wasn't central till really I knuckled down. When I wrote Blackbeard first, I learned a lot about Captain Kidd in the process and the golden age of piracy. And then later I said, God, I better do a nonfiction book on Captain Kidd because I really want to tell, as good a story as anybody that's ever done it, you know.
Well, you brought up an interesting point when you and I first started visiting when we came on together, and a lot of people don't realize who Captain Kidd was. You and I grew up, and I think we're just about the same age. You and I grew up where Captain Kidd was one of the legendary names. There was Blackbeard, and there was Captain Kidd. And honestly, I don't know if there was another name.
Well, Captain Henry Morgan was, but
Yeah,
one of the funniest things,
more of a drink, and you know it.
yes, more of a drink. But the reality is that the three most famous pirates of all time, 100%, almost everybody agrees on it, are Captain Kidd, Blackbeard, and Captain Henry Morgan, who's famous on the rumboat now. Out of those, only one of them was a real pirate, Blackbeard. That's what's interesting. Out of the three most famous pirates, only one of them really, and even Blackbeard was more reluctant than people think. He only at first would refuse to take any English ships in 1716 and 1717. He didn't want to take any English ships. So even Blackbeard was restrictive in the ships that he would take. He was most certainly not a villain of all nations from the get-go.
Well, and when we sit back and we think of piracy, and it's amazing how well, and again, as you brought up, Pirates of the Caribbean brought it all back. But you and I grew up. Errol Flynn became a star because of pirates, and it was that swashbuckling, daring do. But the golden age of piracy was really a very short period.
Well, for the funniest thing about the golden age of piracy is Atlantic, they like to call themselves Atlantic historians, not pirate historians. So we can say Atlantic or pirate historians. They can't even agree on when the golden age of piracy, occurred. So I use what, David Cordingley and Marcus Rediker, who was kind of the pioneers of pirate scholarship in the, 60s, 70s, and 80s. They have it go from 1650 to 1730. So who does that encompass? Captain Henry Morgan, Captain Kidd, and Blackbeard. So it perfectly covers all three of those guys. And of course, some other people consider the golden age only the restricted to the last 15 years, from 1715 to 1730, which would be Blackbeard, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, Calico Jack Rackham, Stede Bonnet, and Black Sam Bellamy. It would be all those guys. But I really think it's really, so I use the 1650 to 1730 though, because I think that is really the golden age to me.
Well, and even then, historically, that's a short time for something that still has the staying power that it does now, right? That we're just so intrigued by the entire pirate thing. And honestly, we don't know what pirates are. We know what the movies have taught us, but we don't know what pirates really were. And it was a hard life. It was a dangerous life. There's a reason, in my take, it's because you either you died, you got captured, your boat sank. I mean, the world was out to kill you in so many different ways. And there were very few success stories. We'll get to some of those in the book, because that's what I love learning about historical fiction and what we think compared to what the reality is. And is that what you found as you studied William Kidd and everybody else?
Well, first of all, Blackbeard, I wrote a book on Blackbeard in 2018 to commemorate the 300th anniversary of Blackbeard's death. That was historical fiction, but my historical fiction is not historical fiction. It's heavily factual historical fiction, where I put them in the scenes exactly where they were as much as I can. And then there's a few scenes between like Blackbeard and the love of his life, Margaret of Marcus. But I'm talking 90%, it's a history book.
Mhm.
Captain Kidd is 100% a history book with 94 pages of endnotes and bibliography. It is not a historical fiction book. It's a history book, 94 pages of endnotes and bibliography. So it is 100% it's narrative nonfiction, but it's narrative nonfiction, American history, pure. So just like any history book you would read, just like Robert Ritchie's, it's just as scholarly as Robert Ritchie's book on Captain Kidd. So I have done historical fiction. This book's not. This is nonfiction, 100% American history.
And I found it fascinating. It's hard for us to put ourselves in the lives of what it was like to live in the 1600s, right? I mean, the things that we take for granted, the things that we don't think of. And on the flip side of it, it was more progressive. They had more things that you may not have thought they had, that they lived a life that we wouldn't have recognized, but a lot of it we would have recognized. Is that what you found?
Yeah, I think one of the things I just wanted to clarify, the difference between right now I'm only writing nonfiction. So I did want to just make that little point before. So I didn't answer your original question, which was, what were sailors like then? There was barely any difference between pirates, privateers, Royal Navy men, wreckers, those who dove for shipwrecks, treasure ships, which were all over. There's guys who were doing it full-time jobs. All of those guys were interchangeable. So one week, Gary Scott Thomas in 1692 might have been a pirate. The next, a month later, he might have been impressed into the Royal Navy. And then a month later, he might have been so tired of that, he became a privateer with William Kidd or some other sea captain. After that, he might have jumped ship in, in Antigua or anywhere and been a wrecker looking for shipwrecks. So the reality is the 1600s were vastly different, but seamen were interchangeable between pirates and non-pirates. And that's what people don't understand today. They try, and some historians too, try and make rigid distinctions between pirates and non-pirates. Those were gray, fuzzy boundaries in the 1600s and 1700s.
Well, and the also is, as you said, as you pointed out in your book, and I read this also, there wasn't instant communication. So as it happened with William Kidd, it happened with others. So the world that you sailed away from would change while you were gone.
Absolutely. I mean, it basically let's just take London as the metropole of for North American English America. It would be a 6 week to sometimes 2.5 month journey to get any transmission. It was outdated by the time London sent, okay, we want you to go hunt down pirates, Governor Belmont, and do all this. It was outdated by the time, 2 months go by, it's outdated information. Now, when Captain Kidd set sea on his expedition to the Indian Ocean from 1696 to 1699, I mean, he was gone for, 2 years and 2 3/4 years, 2 years and 9 months. So, I mean, that's an outrageous, so much change by the time he got back. It was a completely different world. Even the first 6 months he was gone. You're right. So big
Wow.
changes when you went to sea.
Let's talk about Captain Kidd. I mean, born in Scotland, right?
Actually, he's born in Soham, England.
England.
Yeah. So based on the modern genealogical and DNA evidence by Dr. David Boyles, emeritus professor at South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, but he moved to Scotland at a very early age, so he is effectively Scottish. But he's part of he went as a cabin boy or an apprentice at an early age. They don't exactly know when. And then from that point, he went to the Caribbean probably as a merchant, as a merchant cabin boy originally. And then at some point, he became a buccaneer. And the buccaneers were not pirates. They were licensed privateers. They were roguish and they drank like crazy and they were wild. But technically, they were sticking it only to Imperial Spain. They were English, they were French, they were Dutch, and they were, West Indian, and some were of African heritage or mixed heritage, biracial. They were all there to stick it to Spain. So they were nationalistic too. They were, they were good guys too, in at least in terms of their nationalistic purpose on behalf of England and France. They were basically, the Spanish said, well, we own the new world. We control it. And the English and the Dutch and the French said, no, you need to control it. Good luck with that. We're gonna go, steal from you whenever we can. So this is really licensed privateering with, many of the buccaneers did violate their licenses on occasion or get flimsy licenses. But in general, they were fighting Imperial Spain, and it was part of empire building. And the key difference between a privateer and a pirate is privateers have licenses to attack enemy shipping, and they have the legal license to claim the ship and all of its goods, whereas pirates don't have that. So the Buccaneers did have that licensing issue. So technically, they're not pirates. They started out as French boucaniers on the island of Hispaniola, and they were basically just hunters, hunting wild boars and wild cattle. And gradually, they started taking pretty much Spanish, only Catholic, Portuguese, and some Spanish shipping. And then they evolved into the wild and crazy buccaneers of Port Royal, Jamaica, the wickedest city on earth. And Captain Kidd, was there. He was a Port Royal guy. He was a buccaneer, but he was sticking it to Spain with a privateering license. So the
And
Buccaneers are not strictly pirates.
And when you bring up the wickedest city in the world, that is where we get all of our pirate lore, right? About what Pirates of the Caribbean, right? You were talking about how you love that ride. That's just basically a cleaned up, sanitized version, a romanticized version of what the city maybe kind of was. Except, in the real world, you could die in a heartbeat, right?
Yeah, I mean, Port Royal, it was wild. I mean, there was obviously, a lot of gambling, prostitution, heavy drinking, fighting. And it was a frontier Deadwood. It was Deadwood of the pirate age, or even, but then don't forget that New York City and Newport in Captain Kidd's era in the 1690s were pirate strongholds on the North American coast. They were never quite as wild as Port Royal, Jamaica, though. The wickedest city on earth. You got to love that.
I do. I tell you, I loved some of the language you get to use. I love the fact that it's the first book I've read in a while that used the word rapscallion. I love that. I can't remember, you were talking about, was Belmont's wife, was it either profligate or prolificate? Which word was that?
That's a good question. Well, she was prodigal, but yeah, she was a wise. She spent money. She gambled.
She
You know,
gambled. That's the part I
yeah, yeah.
wanted
Belmont couldn't control his young wife. She was like 25 years younger than him. And let's face it, Belmont's not the good guy in the Captain Kidd story.
No,
So
no, not at all. And that's the thing. I wanted to get back to William Kidd, right? That so you start the book off with this amazing thing where he takes over this, because he's found out the world has changed, and him and his buddies take over this friendship, I believe,
yeah,
right? And then and that starts. He takes the ship and he goes from there, and he
legally, I
becomes
mean,
the
he's fighting on behalf of the. So yes, at the beginning, not to give away the opening scene of the book, but yes, he takes the privateer St. Rose. But at that point, he did fight with the French against the Dutch, but he would never fight against England. See that? So Captain Kidd was a buccaneer and then a privateer. Privateer buccaneer is interchangeable, except for the buccaneers were a specific time and place. But they're one and the same. They're licensed privateer. And so was fighting on a French ship. There were 8 English seamen. He was one of them. And he led the stealing of that ship when once he learned that England had declared war on France. So, because he was loyal to England, he was loyal to the English crown at all times. Even when he was maybe taking Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch ships, maybe fighting a little bit for the French, he mostly fought for the English, really. And so, and they were interchangeable. Remember, these crews are mixed. They're not all Englishmen and Frenchmen. And, there's even some Spaniards who fought who were, maybe not as strong Catholics who were fighting on these ships, or maybe mixed blood guys who were French and Spanish. There's a lot of things going on where it's not rigidly defined empires. So Captain Kidd did take the ship, and then he's a hero. He gets connected to Governor Codrington, probably the richest guy in the Caribbean, the governor of the Leeward Islands, and he's fighting the French and he's kicking their ass. He's the good guy. He's Captain Kidd, the war hero. He's a privateer, licensed, taking enemy ships. And then, but he had already established a home in New York at that point, and the love of his life lived there, Sarah Bradley Cox, who was married to an elderly flour merchant, but was in love with Captain Kidd. So he makes it back to New York, and he's immediately a hero in New York in basically March of 1691.
It is a complicated road. Codrington becomes his sponsor, and he grew up a poor kid. I mean, you didn't. Yeah, as you pointed out, you went to sea to find your fortune mainly, because you didn't have a lot of different options, and for him to start to succeed and then find this guy who believes in him
Yeah,
and starts supporting him and helps him move into a different stratosphere of society
yeah,
than I'm taking. I didn't even. I would think that he would not think that was possible, right?
yeah,
That all of a sudden this world opens up to him, and then goes to New York. And we'll get into when did he start thinking of himself, because he was very loyal to England, but when did he start thinking of himself as an American?
yes,
And then the whole thing with Sarah, because that, honestly, Samuel, my only critique is you could have spent 5 more chapters on the whole Sarah, her husband's,
yeah, yeah.
I mean, it was fascinating. And you never, I don't think if I was an author, I don't think I'd ever be bothered to somebody come out to me and said, I just wish you'd written more.
Well, I did. So here's the answer to that, which is always interesting. A peek behind the scenes in the director's cut. Those director's cut movies?
Yeah, this
Sometimes
guy,
there's a little flunk, but a lot of times they're better. I just watched Last of the Mohicans director's cut. It has maybe 18 more minutes. It's better. Daniel Day-Lewis, there's some cool scenes. So my director's cut, or author's cut, we'll call it, was 1,050 pages long. And I say, well, you're not there yet. I should have told you that. But right at the end, you'll see that. I wanted, because he's my ninth great grandfather, I really wanted to get everything he ever did and sort of critique. Well, is it accurate or not? Because the mythology is overtaken Kidd, like a lot of people, the founding fathers, Lincoln, there's a lot of people, Patton, people that just, the mythology just overtakes everything. So obviously I had to cut that down and, down to if you factor in my endnotes and bibliography, it's 384 pages plus 94. So it's looking at around more 480 total. Well, so basically half. Now, and I had a lot more endnotes. Remember, a lot of that was endnotes. So that original book had a lot of that, had a lot more on DNA and a lot of other things in it. I had to cut it back because publishing these days, they really want you at like 90,000 words. And mine comes in at like 122 with the endnotes and stuff, probably more like 135. So
Wow.
I'm already on the longer end. But you're right. There's a lot more to the Captain Kidd story. And I'm glad that you saw that. That's a insightful thing that you're mentioning.
Well, because I just found it so fascinating about this guy's take. And the bad thing about getting into society as when you've got a patron is now you're beholden, right? So you're at the whim of everything. And Kidd made good money. Now, he didn't make two. Is that his name? Thomas Two? He didn't make some of the money. We'll get into that. Thomas Two, I had to read that. In today's money, he got $42 million in treasure.
I think
Or
it was actually over 120, but his personal
3
take.
million. The boat was like one trip was like $42 million haul.
Yeah, well, actually, it was more like over 120 for the whole ship. But remember, these Red Sea men were let me separate first and back up and go with Captain Kidd first. Captain Kidd,
I just want to go all over the places because there's so much interesting stuff.
yeah. Well, it's okay though. But Captain Kidd in the Caribbean made good money as a privateer because he's getting a cut of every ship, and they're taking some prizes. So he bought real estate properties in New York in 1688, 1689 timeframe. So he already established. He didn't go, unlike a lot of privateers and pirates, because remember they're virtually indistinguishable in a lot of cases. Just wasted their money on liquor and women right away. I mean, the wickedest city earth that most of them do it. Captain Kidd was a little different. He invested in real estate properties in New York, which was very liberal and tolerant back then in terms of it was multi-ethnic, unlike Puritan Boston or Quaker Pennsylvania. Had kind of looked the other way for smuggling and piracy, just like Newport, Rhode Island, just like Charleston did a little bit. Remember, piracy kind of built America up. The money Captain Kidd made was good money, and he was a wealthy guy from privateering. But the big money that you're talking about with Thomas Two happened beginning in the early 1690s. Basically, let's just call it from 1690 to 1690, 1700. Those takes were in the Indian Ocean against the Great Mughal of India. Those treasure ships were $20 million to $200 million. Now that's split between the captain gets a lot of it, but remember he had merchant sponsors. So they're taking a huge cut because he was a privateer. He had a license, but he didn't have a license to go to the Indian Ocean. He had a license to go to Africa. So he violated his license in 1693 and then again in 1695. So Thomas Tew took a ship worth 120 million bucks, brought it back to Newport. He's celebrated as a hero, and he launched the Red Sea Man. They called him the Red Sea Man, or revolution. It was the first major gold rush in American history. The 1690s, people were going all over from America, from Newport, New York, Port of New York, a little bit from Boston, a little bit from Charleston, a little bit from Philadelphia. And they would go into the Indian Ocean and get these treasure ships, taking money from the Great Mughal of India and those ships. And that's Thomas Tew. That's when he got that huge money. Captain Kidd in 1696 was sent to hunt down those pirates as a privateer.
Mm. Well, my thing with Thomas too is that it's the quintessential nothing's ever good enough. This guy walks away with $42 million
Yeah.
and decides I need to go get more, which is, they've sat back and said the psychology of a billionaire.
Yeah.
Most billionaires are kind of almost have a brain disease, if you will. They're almost psychopath because at some point, if you're on your way to $1 billion, you're going to have $40 million or $120 million or
Yeah.
$380 million.
Yeah.
Most of us would go, "Hey, I'm good. I'm
Yeah.
good." But the
Yeah.
billionaire goes, "No, I'm going to risk it all and try to get the billion," which is what Thomas too did, which led to his demise.
Yeah.
Not a happy ending for old Tom.
No, he did. Well, what happened is he came back to Newport. He raided in 1693. He came back in late 1690, or yeah, no, he came back in 1694, and he tried to get a license from the governor of Rhode Island, who said no, didn't, because they were flinging around money in Newport. I mean, they came back with $120 million, the crew and him and everyone. And he had to pay off his merchants who were in Bermuda, actually. And so he paid off them, and they took a hefty cut because there were several of them. And then he got his gigantic cut, and then the men got their cut, but they were flinging around money like crazy. And the governor of Rhode Island was like, well, I'm not going to give this guy a privateering license. This is a little, I'm going to get in trouble here. Because by then the tide hadn't turned, but it was turning a little bit in terms of the money that was coming in colonial America, because there was Edward Randolph, who was and some of these other sort of crown officials were complaining to London about how much money was coming in and that it was illegal. So Thomas Chew's crew and others were like, you got to go out again. And he couldn't fight them off. And all of a sudden his wife and daughters are in diamonds and earring, so he goes to New York, which is not the wickedest city on earth, but the next in line, that in Newport. And he gets a license from Governor Fletcher, Benjamin Fletcher, who Captain Kidd knew. And he gives him a license. Thomas Chew goes back to the Indian Ocean. And yes, he gets blasted by cannon shot from one of the great Mughal ships who fought hard.
He got
in
shot
1695.
Cannon, y'all. He got shot with a cannon. Can you imagine what happens when you get shot by anywhere to 15 to 24 pound lead ball?
Yeah, you get disemboweled like Thomas Chew.
Yeah. And not a lot left when that happened. I was fascinated by that, but again, because I jump all over these things because there's so many different topics that I've just had fun with. Now let's get back to Sarah. Sarah was the love of Kidd's life, and it's amazing as you think about the womanizing, you think about in the words of the day, the whoring, right? That went on, but he was smitten to the point of questionable behavior when it comes to Sarah. Again, my opinion, my interpretation of that. How did he meet Sarah? When did he meet her?
Unfortunately, we don't know exactly when. But it was 1688. I think that he had a property, one of his real estate properties, I think, through her husband, William Cox, was a flour merchant who dealt with a lot of sea captains. So Captain Kidd probably most likely knew her first husband, who was William Cox. He was a Dutch flour merchant who, was very wealthy. But Sarah, I'm not sure Sarah was madly in love with him. It was an arranged marriage forced by her father, who was a sea captain. So Sarah, Bradley Cox Kidd, who eventually married Captain Kidd, and we're going to get to that, was sort of betrothed to this guy by her father, forced her. She was 15 years old when she married Cox, who was over 30, or like at least 30 at that point.
And this was way more common than we like to think. I mean,
back then especially, it was about security, and unfortunately, Sarah didn't have a lot of say in it. Well, at some point in 1688, she's clearly, her and Kidd are somehow involved to some extent, because they, by 1689 at least, they had a child together out of wedlock. And so Sarah and Captain Kidd got married when Captain Kidd, he got stuck in the Caribbean because his ship got stolen from him by his crew, who turned pirate. because Captain Kidd refused to provide it. So he got stuck in the Caribbean longer than he wanted to. He was already established in New York, but he got back in March of 1691, and he and Sarah Cox had died by then. But she had married she had married this Dutch guy, William Hort, who was kind of a gold digger, who was probably trying to get, because her estate was tied up. Her first husband's estate was tied up. So this gold digger guy kind of got in there, who was also a merchant and sea captain, probably knew Kidd too. So Captain Kidd probably knew all these guys. And so they had a relationship, but she was unmarried for a year, between her and her, child with Captain Kidd, was given to Captain Kidd's parents in Maryland. And so what happened is Captain Kidd and her marry. John Hurt dies 2 days later. Captain Kidd's married to Sarah Kidd, and they're, and it's a big deal. It's, they're married at the Fort William Church, and that's on the day that Jacob Leisler is hung and beheaded for usurping the governorship in New York. So there's all this crazy stuff coming in. And by then, Captain Kidd's a war hero because he's brought down Jacob Leisler, who's sort of usurped and taken over the governorship of New York. So Captain Kidd is kind of like, that movie Zelig or the one with Tom Hanks. What's Forrest Gump? He's everywhere,
And it was well known. And the fact that, Ort died and we really don't know how.
Yeah.
And then 2 days later,
Captain Kidd, was handy with a sword and tough as hell. So, yeah.
Well, and my first thought was, well, the first husband died too. He was older, but still, once you have the precedence of going, wonder what happened to William Hort. Then you sit back and go, well, the first husband was the rich one. I wonder what happened to him. You start going.
Well, he drowned though. So he was there. He, unfortunately, another thing is he was a supporter of Leisler. He was a high up ranking. He was a public official. Yes, William Cox, the flour merchant who was elderly Dutchman, who Sarah was forced to marry. But he treated her family well, and I think she cared about him. But she was in love with Kidd. Kidd, a strapping seaman, sea captain, was much more interesting than the elderly Dutch flour merchant. Kidd was English too. That was a big deal in New York, because remember, New York was mostly Dutch, but had been taken over by the English in 1664. So being English put you in sort of higher social standing, made you, a little more important in Dutch New York at that time. So, but William Cox actually drowned off Staten Island. He was there to pay tribute for Leisler, Jacob Leisler, who had taken over as the lieutenant governor of New York, but really was unliked, and he was kind of a tyrant. So she didn't kill him, is what I'm saying. Or that's a different thing. We don't know. It's doubtful that Sarah was involved, though, just because she was such a good Christian and very devout. But she and Kidd, they definitely had their thing before she was.
What's to say? A good Christian who had a child out of wedlock.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So, she picked and chose her morals, as we all do. We all do.
A lot of Christians do. Let's admit it.
That's what I'm saying. We still do. I consider myself one, and I'm as guilty as anybody. But when did Kidd start considering himself an American? Because, and this is what I got from your book, that he considered himself an American at the end of his life.
Well, I think here's the thing about America. It's an interesting thing because historians grapple with when did English Anglo-Americans, part of British or English North America, transition to Americans. A lot of people think it's like on the eve of the American Revolution. I don't agree at all. Looking at these records from I think a lot of the historians just haven't looked closely at the records of the late 1600s. The reason that that North Americans were becoming American and less British, they still loved the crown. So Captain Kidd worshipped England. They all wanted to be part of the strongest military and navy in the world. By the 1700s, it was. England was the superpower. By Captain Kidd's era, England was emerging as the dominant superpower, really of the world because of its maritime fleet, And it really was. By the American Revolution, it was 100% the strongest. So everyone they bought English goods. They loved England. They loved the crown. They loved the king. Even up to even the Revolution, Ben Franklin and Washington, they loved England. I mean, people, you forget that they didn't turn until really after the Boston Massacre,
Ben
1773.
Franklin's son never stopped
Yeah,
loving it.
Ben Franklin's son
I mean,
never. And Ben Franklin, basically disowned him. So what I'm saying is the key thing that I'm trying to get at here, and I should have been quicker, is the British called Americans, Belmont, as you see in my book, he called us country people. He called us a rabble. He called us those wicked Americans, those wicked people. England never looked at us as equals. The Puritans wanted to be separate, but England never looked at us as Americans. So we always looked at ourselves as separate. We were Americans early on. You can even say the Puritans were, early on were defiant. They were defiant towards the crown. So there was an element of defiance against the Navigation Acts. There was an element of we were other. We weren't the same as Englishmen. Remember, all we wanted leading up to the Revolution was English rights because we loved England. Well, in Captain Kidd's era, it was the same thing. We wanted to be left alone to do commerce. That's the one thing the Americans have always been. Don't take my money from me with heavy taxation and let me live and let live when it comes to jobs. I want a job. I want to work and I want to provide for my family. So we were American in the 1690s. That's my feeling. And I think Captain Kidd and the way England treated us and the way Captain Kidd looked at England. Now, clearly, when he's in London undergoing a trial, he hated England. He had divorced himself from the mother country by then. And he had called them, he had separated himself clearly, as you saw in my book. So that was a sharp divide. That was like, not only I'm American, but I hate England, at that point. And he was loyal to the crown. He was the trusty and well-beloved Captain Kidd of King William III of England, which is amazing.
It is, and it's such a great story. You got to read the book, and there's I don't know, you spent 4 or 5 chapters on the battle in India, the whole thing that he was going when he was the Portuguese against Portuguese ship, the Portuguese man of war, and where you get to show off how good he was at it. It wasn't just happenstance; it was being able to take every bit of information that he had and be able to make the prudent decisions even when his crew didn't agreed with him all the time, even though he had trusted advisors, but still his ability to accumulate information and decide was why we're still talking about him today. Sterling Oak Cabinetry has one goal: to build the cabinets of your dreams. They literally specialize in custom cabinetry. No cookie cutter, everything looks the same stuff that you find at the big box stores. Your kitchen is the centerpiece of your home, and your home is your biggest investment. They can work with you or your designer to build just what you want with the materials and finish that you want. And because they're a brand new company, they'll be getting busier and busier, but if you order right now, they'll get your order to you in 6 to 8 weeks. In the world of cabinetry, that's blindingly fast. Contact Rob Scovman at RSKOVMAND @yahoo.com or go to sterlingoakcabinetry.com and get your dreams made reality tomorrow. Let's talk about the inevitable end of life. Once I leave this earth, I can't do anything for my loved ones, but I've just learned by pre-planning a funeral or cemetery in advance takes the guesswork out when death occurs suddenly and your mind is clouded with grief. Dignity Memorial can help. My friend Tina Skurla pre-plans funeral and cemetery arrangements so loved ones don't have to. They're North America's largest provider of funeral, cremation, and cemetery services. They're dedicated to getting every detail right, and they do that by listening to you. I know it's a hard subject, but I also know we all see the sense and value of what Dignity Memorial does. Use the promo code Gary to get 25% off at Willow Glen Funeral Home. Reach out to my friend Tina Skurla today. She's committed to helping families not go through the tragedy of loss alone. Click on the link, use the promo code Gary, or email her at dmppa@tinaskurla.com or call 408-398-7050.
Yeah, I think a lot of he was a good sea captain, and I don't think he's gotten his just due on that, because we've so the pirate mythology and the buried treasure is so overtaken Captain Kidd that, people just don't even know this. Like, that's why the original three first chapters of my book are him as a war hero, crown privateer. And then he comes back to New York, he's the war hero. And then he goes to England. Remember, when he goes to England, Captain Kidd knows or interacted with, usually on favorable terms, but sometimes adversarially, with 7 colonial governors and assistant governors. 7, this common born Englishman, who we know is the most scandalous, villainous cutthroat of all time, which, let's admit is just mythology. It's basically, how did this common born Englishman get to know all these different people, these governors? He's hobnobbing with the richest of New York. He's the trusty and well-beloved Captain Kidd of the King of England, recruited by, by the lords of England, the high-ranking people of the Whig junto, Admiral Russell, the Duke of Shrewsbury, who was the Secretary of State, the highest people in England, recruit him to go hunt down pirates in the Indian Ocean. So it's amazing that a common-born guy, common-born Englishman, really raised as a Scotsman, went to sea at an early age. But remember, he was well schooled. You can see from his letters, he was a good writer. He wrote a lot more clearly than other people. He was succinct and he was educated. So he was schooled in navigation. He wasn't schooled in like Latin and Greek like some of the wealthiest English would be, but he was taught to read and write, and he had an education because he came from sort of a solid Protestant family, in Soham, England.
Well, that's
And
what I
only Scotland too. They're connected to Scotland too.
Yeah, and so I said his ability to process information it was great. And again, when you think about privateering, piracy, whatever, you're having to capture another ship who's like against an experienced captain too. And the fact that he was so successful at it, right? That he would put his wits against yours, figure out how to use the oars, how to tack with the wind, how to get in the right position, when to board. I mean, there were a lot of decisions that went into battles that we just kind of go, oh yeah, and then he did this. No.
Yeah.
The meal may come out and be put in front of you, but you have no idea what had to go on, not only in the kitchen, but in the farm and everything else that had to go into putting the thing in front of your face. And that's what I feel like with these ship battles that we just kind of gloss over them. And I'm glad you didn't, because there's a million things that go into it. And that's what I said about the processing, his ability to go, okay, no, now we need to do this
Yeah.
is exemplified, which I liked.
Yeah, especially with without giving the story away, Muni's crew, he's going there to hunt. Let's face it, he's going to the Indian Ocean to hunt down pirates. He's licensed by the King of England and the highest ranking officials. Lord Belmont is going to be the governor of New York, to go to the Indian Ocean, but he has a mutinous crew who wants to be Thomas Chew. They want a Thomas Chew voyage. They want $120 million payoff. So they're getting antsy because it's the voyage from hell, like David Grann's book, The Wager. It's tough. And so Captain Kidd, though, amazingly holds them together much longer than he had any right to be honest, because these guys want money badly, and they have one disaster. They have storms. They have Royal Navy guys after them trying to impress 35 to 40 of Kidd's seamen. They have tropical disease outbreaks that kills 35 guys. They have no water. They're being attacked by some of the natives of the different islands that they're going to. They're being attacked by Portuguese. So it's a tough world. So you're right. Captain Kidd had to do a lot to keep things under control as long as he did.
Again, it's right there in the history books. You can find this out for yourself, especially, but you'll never find a more research thing than Samuel's book. But I wanted to ask this question of you. Was William Moore that good of a cannoneer that Kidd just felt he couldn't kick him off the ship? Because William Moore ends up being a big name in what happened to Captain Kidd. but could he? And he was a guy, was a ne'er do well. He was a malcontent, and was he just so good at his job that Kidd couldn't get rid of him? Just kick him off the ship? What's your take on it?
Well, the problem, I'm not, that's a good question. Captain Kidd had a crew, he got 80 of his crew in London. So a lot of those were Englishmen, some Scots probably, maybe a few Irish, Well, actually, he didn't have a lot of Irish. He had 7 Scots, mostly English. Some of them were colonial Americans that had probably come over with him when he was in London because he was there for like 9 months. But then he went back to New York and he picked up 80 other crewmen. That's when he got William Moore. I'm not sure he knew about William Moore had 2 prison sentences to his name at that point. One for attacking his captain. I'm not sure Captain Kidd knew about that. William Moore was popular around the docks. He was an experienced cannoneer. He had fought in the Caribbean, so Kidd might have known him in the Caribbean, but not known that he was in prison for attacking his captain on a ship called the Golden Hind. So, and then during his thing, Moore probably at first was more subtle than, and then at some point it escalated. So he would have had to drop him off, in, Surat or one of the cities along the Indian coast, the Malabar coast of India. He would have had to get rid of him probably there because that's by then Moore was clearly a problem. I'm not sure that he wanted to get, remember he lost 35 guys from tropical disease. You had to have enough guys to fire your cannons.
Mm-hmm.
It's a big deal. Losing those 35 guys, and he almost lost 40 guys to Commodore Thomas Warren. Remember, tried to impress his men, but he rode away during the night. He wouldn't have been able to fire a proper broadside because you needed at least 4 and really more like 6 to 7 guys on each cannon, on each carriage gun. These were, 18 pound, some of them were, 12 and 18 pounders. They needed a substantial crew. And so he probably thought I can rein him in, I can control them. And and then by then it escalated to the point where he couldn't, So it's a good question, though. You've raised a very important question.
Well, and because I just wanted to know it, and I kind of figured he just had to be too much valuable. And they had this form of dysentery that you were talking about. It wiped out so many guys. I mean, it was basically bloody diarrhea. Think about that, guys. Just wrap your head around what it must have been like to be on that ship. That even his brother-in-law, whom he loved, ended up getting it. And really, his brother-in-law never recovered from it, right?
No, Samuel Bradley, Sarah Bradley's younger brother, he took on the voyage, and he treated him. He became a good seaman, but he got sick on Mohilia Island off the coast of Madagascar. Mohilia Island, I guess is what it's called now. And then he stayed with Kidd the whole voyage and went back. The Kidd had to drop him off at St. Thomas because by then he was desperate and he was dying. And Kidd didn't want to let him off, at that point, because at that point he was a wanted man. And the crew definitely didn't want him to do it, but Captain Kidd did. He sent him away in a boat with food and water. And of course, he was thrown in jail by the Danes on the island of St. Thomas was controlled by the Danish then. And then he made his back to New York in 1703, but died by then. He never recovered. A lot of these guys were just wasted after dysentery. They called it the bloody flux. It was nasty.
Just when I was reading about that, I'm like, can you imagine what it'd been like to be on that ship? I mean, and you were just so scared. You had to be so scared at all times. What I was saying about how dangerous it was. And you bring up the storms and the other ships, but just the disease itself. And you're on this enclosed space. And they had no idea how it was being transmitted. I mean, these were just the ship surgeon, as you brought up, was worthless.
He was a drunk, Robert Bradingham, who testified falsely against Kidd. So, he was nasty. He didn't do anything. He made it worse with all this sudorifics and purging, bowel purging and laxatives. And, I don't know if he tried leeches, but, leeches were big then too. So, it didn't help. Whatever he did didn't help.
Why did Belmont hate Kidd so much? And that's where it ended up. What's his name? It's Richard Coote, known as the Earl of Belmont. But why, where did, because he's the guy that ended up just making life miserable for everyone, but certainly for William Kidd.
Yeah, Lord Belmont, remember, was a sponsor on Kidd's voyage, and Kidd didn't want to go on the voyage to the Indian Ocean. So his 1696 to 1699 voyage to the Indian Ocean was sponsored by Lord Belmont, who was in London at the time. He was a Whig, House of Commons member. He organized the voyage with Robert Livingston, who was a colonial New Yorker who basically organized this and was backed by the king and the wealthy Whig ministers, the Duke of Shrewsbury. So Belmont at that point in London coerced Kidd. He threatened to take his ship and threatened to take his men from him if he didn't agree to do the voyage, because Kidd tried to back out. He's like, I don't want to go hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean. Kidd did not want to do it. So the most famous pirate of all time didn't even want to go to the Indian Ocean, where he became the most famous pirate of all time. Didn't want to do it. Lord Belmont forced him to do it. Lord Belmont had already been earmarked to be the governor of New York, Massachusetts Bay Colony, and New Hampshire by that point. And so, but he hadn't taken office. He was still in London. So Kidd goes off on his voyage. Lord Belmont takes office in New York in May of 1698 or April of 1698. And then by a year later, he's in Boston when Captain Kidd returns from his oceanic voyage. So Captain Kidd's trying to get in touch with his sponsor, Lord Belmont. That's his business partner. That shouldn't be his adversary. He's trying to get a pardon because he knows he's a wanted man. He's a wanted man, though, for taking two legal captures in the Indian Ocean. The Quedagh Merchant and the Ruparel were 100% legal captures that presented French papers. So, but Captain Kidd's still a wanted man because he followed in the footsteps of Henry Avery and Thomas Chew and the real pirates of the Indian Ocean. Captain Kidd was sent there to hunt them, but he took two ships legally, but they were worth 60 to 100 million bucks, one of them. And so the Quedagh Merchant, so he became a wanted man because he came on the scene after the pirates. So he comes back to Boston, to Belmont, who lures him in with the saying that he will give him a pardon. And Belmont's in a tough bind, though, because he's a sponsor of the voyage. So he has to protect himself and the Whig junto and the king, who are the sponsors of the voyage. He has to protect them and himself. So he has to throw Captain Kidd to the wolves and locks him up in Boston in Stone Prison, which is nasty.
Wow. And yeah, we can't comprehend how nasty it was. I mean, I can only imagine the mental torture that Kidd went through.
Yeah, and he was, unfortunately for Captain Kidd, he was incarcerated in Stone Prison, for 8 months at least, and then and then he had to be shipped to London 2 months, in a ship's hold, chained, and then he had more than a year, so almost for nearly 2 years, he almost died too because he was just so worn down on bread and water, and rare meat and vegetables. He almost died. He got really sick, by the time he reached London. He was broken down. Luckily, he made a little bit of a comeback, but by the time his trial occurred, the English crown withheld all of his money, didn't give him lawyers, kept him in solitary confinement, chained up. He wasn't allowed any air or water, air out in the yard. He wasn't allowed any visitors except for, two people. They basically had decided that they were going to make Captain Kidd the example because they didn't catch any of the real Red Sea pirates. It was
Well,
bad.
he was being punished. And you'll learn this thing when you read the book. They would love to have punished Henry Avery.
Yeah.
But since they couldn't, because he got away with it, he's the only successful pirate that I know of. And you do a great job of explaining that. But since they couldn't get him, we'll just we'll put all the sins of all the pirates on William Kidd, and here we go.
Who surrendered Lord Belmont with the understanding that Belmont was giving him a pardon because he had taken the two ships with French passes legally. But, Belmont was in a tough position. He would look bad if he didn't throw Kidd under the bus, or to the wolves, I should say back then, you know. So it
Henry
was
Every
it was
got
it's
away
a
with it.
big the Captain Kidd story is a huge political scandal and the trial of the century. It's not just a little pirate tale. It's one of the greatest trials of all time, and it's one of the greatest political scandals in English history. What he did, the sins, like you said, he paid for the sins of other men.
Henry Every got away with it. Disappeared into history, right? We don't know what happened to Henry Every. That he took all of his ill-gotten gains and he was horrible. He was, as you pointed out, they tried to romanticize him and look the other way, but what this guy did was horrific. And that's the things when you sit back and we romanticize it. But with William Kidd, because I know I'm running out of time, but I have to hit these things. You being the great, great, grandson and stuff, and you talk about the big story. Think about it. He was written about in some way or the other. He was used as a basis with Washington Irving, with L. Frank Baum, who you may not know his name, but you know his other work, The Wizard of Oz,
Oh,
Edgar
no.
Allan Poe,
Yeah.
Bob Dylan.
Bobby
You know,
Dylan.
I mean,
Wow.
it. They did children's books about it. They've had him in manga. I don't even know if I'm mispronouncing that word
Yeah.
right. But I mean, he is still ubiquitous in the story of. I know this is going to sound a little bit preposterous, but in the story of mankind,
Yeah.
William Kidd has a chapter.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. And he was, he's an interesting story. And, he's the pirate treasure is a lot of why, he became so. I mean, people are still searching for Captain Kidd's treasure all
And he
over
did
the place.
bury some, right? I mean, to explain that real quick. He did bury some.
Yes. So when he returned, and was trying to strike a deal with Belmont, he was for 3 weeks. He joined with his wife and daughters, which is the amazing thing. Sarah is part of the story. So for the women out there, they got to know that Sarah plays a key role in this book. She's awesome. My ninth great grandmother. I like she's in a lot of ways as interesting as Captain Kidd. But in any case, yes, he didn't trust Lord Belmont, rightfully so, right? As it turns out. So he hid some treasure, buried some treasure on Gardner's Island with John Gardner, who he met with and, treated very respectfully, not like a pirate at all. And, and he took a number of Kidd's goods and stored them on the island. Captain Kidd also stored them with Thomas Paine, who was in Newport, outside Newport, Rhode Island, who was a good friend of his, who was a buccaneer, but who helped build Trinity Church. Captain Kidd helped build Trinity Church in New York, which still stands today. And they also left money with his good friend Thomas Clark, Captain Thomas Clark, who was also helped build Trinity Church and was like the coroner and governor's council member in New York. So Captain Kidd hobnobbed with a lot of pretty kind of established, reputable sea captains. Doctors helped him when he first came back. A judge and a doctor on Oyster Bay, New York, helped him right away. His lawyer, James Emott, he was connected with all the highest, the people of the highest echelons of colonial society. But he didn't trust Lord Belmont, and that's why he distributed his treasure, buried some, and distributed with his good friends, who were high-ranking colonials. These weren't just the proletariat, piratey kind of guys. They were a little piratey because everyone was a little piratey back then. It was a different era. It was a little more a rogue could be a gentleman too.
Well, I mean, as you pointed out, John Paul Jones, very famous historical patriotic figure. He he was William Kidd if you don't get caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. I mean,
Well,
almost the exact same kind of story.
well, to the English, they made cartoons of him as a pirate. They called him John Paul. They didn't call him. They called him John Paul because remember he added the Jones later. He was actually John Paul. But John Paul Jones, they called him John. Paul Jones the pirate. I guess he added the Jean, I guess later. But in any case, yes, he was a licensed Continental Navy man, but they called him a pirate, the English. But yes, he ended up killing a Muna seaman with a sword, but he got off. and he was called a pirate by the English. So they were almost the same guy. They were both tough, hard driving, hard fighting, demanding, but good at their job guys. They weren't that different. Both had a Scottish connection. So you're right to draw that parallel.
And listen, you can read the book. Let's just say it didn't end well for Captain and Kidd, but Sarah had to go on. I mean, and you talk about Sarah being an interesting character. Her world falls apart, and here she has two young daughters, and she has to keep moving forward.
Yeah, it was tough time for Sarah. If you ever have a spouse, you want them to be like Sarah Kidd because she was awesome. She spent 8 months, 8 solid months in Boston trying to get Kidd out of jail. She sent petitions to Lord Belmont. She tried to get money from some guys who were little piratey guys. She sent them off on missions to collect the money. Remember, because Kidd had stored the money. He didn't trust Belmont, so he stashed his money with a lot of different people. Sarah tried, and Sarah was in on that. She was like, okay, if you need money, Sarah, here's who you go to. So she was filing petitions, living with her daughters. She was doing a lot to help Captain Kidd during a brutal, brutal Boston winter. It was one of the coldest in memory. The complete Boston Harbor froze over completely, which didn't always happen. And so Sarah Kidd was a heroic individual. And I forgot your original point.
Oh, just the fact that she just kept moving forward. That
Kept
her
moving forward after, yes. So after,
thrown out of the
sorry,
house,
thanks
lost
for
all.
helping me. Captain Kidd, though, yes, after he was shipped off to England, she left Boston, returned to New York, and once she finds out that he's, I don't want to say how he ended, but didn't end well. They tried to take everything from her. Her house, even though it had nothing to do with Captain Kidd's piratey, alleged piratical stuff. They took everything from her just because she was attainted by a pirate, which meant that she was attainted meant she was just married to the guy. None of it was pirate goods. There were no pirate goods. He took them. They were legal. Everything he took was legal. So they took everything from her, and it took her like 2 years to get it back. And then by that time she remarried. She did not remarry for 2 years though, which was a long time because, she was in love with Captain Kidd. They had a true romance. I mean, this is one of the greatest love stories in New York history. She did a lot for him. She fought for him, but her life at some point, it was turmoil. And so she did change the daughters' names once she married her new husband,
And had
in
more children with him.
1703. Yeah. And she had 3 children with him. He was a good guy though,
Yeah.
So at least
She did get the
he
happy ending.
lived a long life. And
But a happy ending.
she lived a long life. She learned to read and write, and so that's it.
I find it fascinating, and I know you have to love all he's been throughout history, movies, the whole thing. Talk about historical taking liberties. At some point, they had William Kidd being a big love affair with a Muslim princess
Okay, good.
who had a very tragic story there, because that's all Henry Every. You got to read the book. You got to read the book, and you'll find the links here underneath, right on the website. You'll get it right here on this episode. All the links, and you order your book, and I know this interview was all over the place, Samuel, because as you can tell, I just had so much fun and enjoying it and loving this time in life.
Well, it's okay. It's fun to be all over the place because there's so many angles with Kidd, and I'm just glad you like the book and you learned something new too. Which is great.
Well, I kind of find it funny that the great-great-grandson of one of the most famous sea captains in the world is a geologist who lives as far away from the ocean as I think you possibly can.
Yes, but we go to the ocean a lot. It's always been kind of believe it or not, a part of our Marquises. We grew up with Captain Kidd stories, but my grandfather had a place in St. Croix, Virgin Islands, and so we always went there. And Captain Kidd went there. Blackbeard went there, and of course, Alexander Hamilton started his career there in Christiansted on the island of St. Croix. So we had a little connection to the Caribbean when I was a kid. Didn't go there all the time, but we would go down there.
So here's my thing. I want you to come back next year when everybody's had a chance to read the book, and we can talk about the ending. And we also just kvetch about all these different names, because you just brought up Blackbeard, Alexander Hamilton, the myth, the reality, the whole thing, and gibbets. We're going to talk gibbets or gibbets. I'm not even sure how you say it, but we're going to talk that when we do this again. If you'll do it again with me,
Sounds good, Gary. I'll be back. Great time.
Samuel Marquis, thank you so much.